I am sitting in my apartment in Yeshivat Keren B'Yavneh. I am surrounded by boxes, bubble wrap, and lots of garbage. We're moving next week, and once this episode drops, I will no longer be a member of the Kollel in Yeshivat Keren B'Yavneh. There are so many question marks about what life is going to be like afterwards. I really hope that this podcast will continue to grow and develop, and I'll be able to make the time and space to invest as much energy as I can, because I really have enjoyed this journey so much. But for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. As the summer winds to a close, we're going to reflect back on some of the very important conversations we've been having on the Shtark Tank podcasts. It's been really special to hear that the episodes that we've put out have really spawned some very interesting conversations. Some people reach out to me with great feedback. Some people discuss it with their friends, their colleagues, their families on their Shabbos tables. And that's been very inspiring and heartwarming for me to hear. And because I think this topic is really about the conversation, it's really about the journey, it's really about the challenge. There are no easy answers, there are no quick fixes. So I thought that it would be really cool to take some of these conversations and put them on the air, record them for everyone to hear and listen to. I firmly believe that these follow-up conversations are among the most important aspects of Shtark Tank, and therefore I'm really excited to do this 2-part series. In today's episode, we will be speaking with a listener who some of you may have heard of. His name is Michael Bloch. He spent over 20 years at a small company that you may have heard of called McKinsey. And it might be cheesy to call him a McKinsey-level mensch, but that's absolutely an accurate portrayal. And we spoke about some of his reactions to the podcast, especially his unique perspective as a Baalei Teshuva. As always, I love to receive all feedback. My email is yaakovwolf@gmail.com. And a reminder that we have our quiet WhatsApp group. The link is in the show notes, so you can go over there and check that out. My name is Yaakov Wolf, and this is Shtark Tank. So when I started this podcast, a lot of people reached out to me with different suggestions of people who I should be speaking to. And one of the names that came up a lot was the name Michael Bloch. And I had heard a little bit of Michael Bloch. I had heard about some of the very, very impressive things he's done, and I had really admired some of his work from afar. And when I reached out to him, I was really honored and humbled that he's actually a listener of the Shtark Tank podcast. So I'm happy to have a conversation with Michael following up on some of these ideas and topics. So Michael, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Yaakov. It's good to see you again in person and be on there for once.
So maybe tell us a little bit about your background. You have a very interesting story, a very interesting professional path, and also a Torah journey that goes alongside it. So maybe you give us a little bit of that background to start off.
I'll give you the personal professional side, and then I'll go back to the sort of Torah journey in parallel with the rest. So I'm from Switzerland originally. I grew up there, studied at the local college, business and technology, worked a bit in the banking world, and then left for the US. I spent 2 years, one in California, in Berkeley, one in New York. I was studying for a PhD. It was the early times of the business use of the internet. That's what I was studying. But then I met my wife, came back to Europe, spent a few months in the university trying to write up the PhD that I had started, but then realized I enjoyed consulting, which I was doing on the side much more than writing up the PhD. So I left college, joined McKinsey that was just building a technology practice then, and spent 23 years at McKinsey, most of them as a partner, a senior partner. We spent 7 years in Switzerland, and for 5 years I led the technology practice in France. And we made Aliyah in 2010, literally 14 years ago, 3 days from now. And I stayed with McKinsey for 11 years here in Israel, serving clients all around the world, mostly large companies, helping them with business, with operations, transformation, strategy. But every year I also worked with nonprofits. I realized quickly you could help nonprofits with the same business toolkit. So I worked with 2 or 3 nonprofits a year on their strategy, on their growth. And frankly, I felt these were amazing projects. They were highly impactful at a different level than saving another few $100 million for a bank, but for me, they mattered more. So about 3 years ago, I decided to leave McKinsey, partly because I was tired and I wanted something new, partly because I really wanted to spend more time with nonprofits. I then looked for the next concept, and after many discussions with many people, I realized that the people who needed the most help were the philanthropic foundations that had hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars of money to invest, to give here in Israel. And I could help these people either grow the nonprofits they were supporting or solve social issues. Let's say you want to increase the amount of computer science students in Israel. You've got $20 million to do it. What's the best approach, the best path? How do you get that done? And last, I discovered that there were a number of new philanthropic funders that wanted to start giving in Israel, either people from the high-tech scene who had made hundreds of millions, or people from the US who were new to Israel. And so I built a small team around me, mostly former consultants, and together we've done something like 30 projects, and I love it. Now, in parallel with that, so I grew up in a non-religious family in Switzerland. When I was in the US was the beginning of my tshuva. Frankly, I think it was the availability of Torah books that started the journey. I had always been interested in Torah, but there was nothing to learn from in Switzerland where I grew up, or in French. But suddenly in the US, I was faced with this world of Kiruv, particularly in New York, Esha Torah, Rabbi Buchwald, and the Lincoln Square scene. There were so many opportunities to learn, and I took advantage of that. And then over time tried to adapt reading here and there. At some point, maybe about 15 years ago, also, with my kids growing up, I didn't mention we've got 3 kids from 22 now to 13. I decided to be a bit more systematic about my learning, and starting going through, I would say, the major works of Torah in a systematic way, starting with the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, all of Mishneh Torah. I'm quite systematic in my learning, so then I went through Daf Yomi. There are many people who finish Daf Yomi. I always joke and say that very few finish Daf Yomi in an halal plane, which is what I did. I learned mostly on my business trips. And then, added chavrutot here and there. And today I spend, 10 to 20 hours a week learning, a little bit depending on the workload, at a significant amount of time. And Baruch Hashem, have been able to grow in my capabilities, even though there's still so much to be done.
And how old were you when this journey started on the learning?
Oh, probably, I was 20 when I started making tshuva gradually, but I would say it accelerated since I came to Israel. Also because coming to Israel forced me to learn Hebrew. That gave me access to a whole new range of learning capabilities. And of course, the availability of Torah teachers. Here you can walk to the neighborhood shul and find Talmidei Chachamim that would be Rabbanim in Europe. So a lot more opportunities to learn from everybody.
And I've always felt that maybe one of the really big challenges that someone in your place would probably feel would be the language, which is such a barrier. Did you have any sort of Hebrew background, even in a non-religious way, from your childhood?
No, in reality, not. And it's been a real challenge. It took me 3 years. Well, look, I was traveling every week, speaking French at home and English at work. But it took me 3 years of intense effort to learn to speak Hebrew well, to the level of speaking with the CEO here in Israel. It took me a few more years to learn enough Hebrew to understand most shiurim and to be able to read, say, halachic works. I'm now working on the Aramaic, which is another set of challenge, and it's harder to speak Aramaic with your friends. So, but I'm now systematically going through list of common words and keywords and trying to grow in Gemara learning on an independent way. I've started to switch my Ask for Gemara from the red one to the blue one, if you know what I mean. And that's a challenge on its own, but it's also a satisfaction that you grow up in your capabilities.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Shtark Tank. What do you think for you has been so meaningful about the discourse in general, just very broadly, the idea of having a podcast about being a mentor in the workforce? Where in your life has that come in the most important way?
Well, look, I think everybody, and I think it's particularly true for Baalei Teshuva and people who are sort of deep in the business world, but everybody struggles with the balance of business life and personal life, and in this case, business life, personal life, and Torah life, or Torah learning. And I think the podcast is the first one that sort of addresses the issue heads on. Others, you can find content, and Rav Ari Wasserman wrote some very interesting books on the topic. Rav Lopiansky did the same. But I think you and the podcast, are the first ones to sort of head on address the challenge and bring different perspectives, some more Torah-based, some more business-based, to the balancing challenge. And I thought that was incredibly helpful. I thought, like every podcast, it's an opportunity to hear from remarkable people. But here it's remarkable people who've solved a challenge, which I find most interesting and most personal. And so in terms of getting inspiration, getting practical advice, the podcast has been invaluable. I think somehow you've also managed to, I would say, build a small community. Interestingly, a lot of the people you had on the show, and I was yesterday going through the list, are people I've known personally, I've met repeatedly, people like Zevi Reinitz, Mo Mernick, Raf Pfeffer, Noam Wasserman, your father, Josh Wolf, Mark Lesnick, all are people who I respect, met with, work with in some context. You've brought many famous authors whose books I've read, Gil Student, Rav Asher Weiss, Michael Eisenberg, Rav Lopiansky, Rav David Lapin. So you feel like you're meeting your friends and your colleagues and your masters and your teachers. And so somehow you build a sort of virtual chabura, which I value very much. And last, I would say, I refer people to the podcast on a regular basis. No later than last Friday, someone came to my home to get advice on his professional life. And he was saying, I'm a Baalei Teshuva, but really the only thing I care about is Torah. The business world is tafel. I said, look, you need to find the balance. And by the way, here's a good podcast. And Rav David Lapin has certain things to tell you. And, that's a virtual chabura, and it's wonderful.
Wow. It's very special. And I really appreciate the opportunity that I've had to put this together and to gather these voices. And I think that the community aspect is a really special one. It's one we actually discussed before, and I hope to develop more in the future. With regards to the idea of balancing, I'm wondering, through your experiences and all of the high level business people that you have spoken to, do you have any particular insights or examples, even from like non-Jews who, because sometimes, right, the more powerful you get, the more busy you get, the less balance you have, which is a bit ironic. So maybe any examples or insights you have from your experiences that you want to share with our listeners?
So I don't know if I want to name names, but I would say that the two or three things that strike me the most in people who are really balanced are people who are very disciplined. And particularly over the years, I've realized how your calendar is where things happen, and how people who master their calendar in many ways master their life. And specifically what I'm referring to is, and the practice I've adopted in recent years, but I wish I would have discovered even earlier, was how taking a blank calendar at the beginning of the year and starting to put in there all the important things for you mattered. So you want to do sports, great. Just set 2 or 3 slots to do sports a week. You want to be learning morning, evenings, chavutot, put it there. You want to go on a walk with your wife to make sure you can talk outside of the house and stay connected. Great, find a slot in there. Once you find slots for the rest, don't worry. Business meetings will fill the rest with ease. But if you start with business meetings, we all know that there's no space at the end left for the important things. And I think the people that I admire the most are people who have this sort of personal discipline to, first work on the things that they care about, and then let the rest expand and fill the space.
That's beautiful. So the last thing I want to ask you about is the community of Baalei Teshuva. It was quite surprising to me how enthusiastic and how much traction this podcast has gotten among Baalei Teshuva specifically. And it was not something that I was expecting. I'm very happy that people who come from a little bit of a different background than maybe me and my chevra are enjoying the podcast and are growing from it. And I've interacted with a lot of them. Do you have any quick takes as to why that might be so? Why specifically Baalei Teshuva have sort of latched onto this resource maybe more than I was expecting?
Well, first of all, we should realize that the word Baalei Teshuva covers a broad range of people. The Rosh Beit Midrash of our local Beit Midrash, something I'm quite involved with. Made Teshuva at age 15. Today he knows most of Shas, Maharal, Rav Kook by heart. So, there's Baalei Teshuva and Baalei Teshuva. But I would say at my own little level, I can relate to that and I understand. I think most Baalei Teshuva, nearly by definition, will be sort of deep in the business world because they don't have the yeshiva training that would push them to be avrechim or to be people who are only involved in Torah. And so by definition, when they think Torah is important, they struggle, number one, with managing the balance as we discussed, but also with the amount of learning they need to catch up with. The Rambam in the beginning of Ilchot Talmud Torah talks about Mishelo Limdo Aviv, he needs to learn on his own because he did not absorb that. People who grew up in the religious world underestimate how much you learn up to age 15, 18, 20 when you get out of yeshiva, and how much catch-up there is to do for someone who didn't absorb that. So by definition, Baalei Teshuva are faced with that challenge and are struggling for responses. They also haven't built, the learning habits, the chavrutot, the learning base that gives them an ability to catch up in an hour and to do so much. At the same time, I'm always reminded, Rabbi Ephraim Buchwald, who was one of the pioneers in Kiruv in New York, the first one to advertise in the subway for Torah classes and so on. He always had this argument that Baalei Teshuva brings a certain energy and passion to Torah that the more jaded, from birth didn't have. Somehow Baalei Teshuva is constantly trying to catch up with himself, to learn from others, to improve himself. And so I think the passion makes them more eager to learn from others, connect with the podcast, and And finally, when you're not when you're in the business world, you have more time more dead time that you can fill with podcasts, while traveling or whatever. So that's also again much more akin to what you're doing.
Interesting. I think those all resonated with me a lot. One of the things that I was thinking about that I wanted to share with you and hear your response to was the fact that oftentimes Baalei Teshuva probably have a much more open mind to being curious and to asking questions and to maybe questioning some of the norms or habits. So if I sort of grew up in a track and I sort of feel myself as going along with the flow, so then if the flow means learning X amount or Y amount or going to this career or that career, so okay, I'll go with that track. Whereas Baalei Teshuva, and this resonates with me a lot. I ask a lot of questions. I think about things a lot. Maybe I overthink things. But one of the things that led me on this journey was my overthinking of things. And maybe Baalei Teshuva have a little more intellectual curiosity and openness to how we approach some of the routines and habits and structures around our Torah and business life. Does that resonate with you?
No, I think that's very right. I look at Baalei Teshuva by definition is a fish that swims against the current. And so that makes him much more sort of willing to challenge himself and constantly rethink things. I remember, 20 years ago, I was dealing with these issues of Torah and science and trying to see ways of reconciling it. And somehow I'm still interested in the issue. Just on Shabbat, I read another book on the topic. I think you're constantly revisiting the things that you started to think about at the beginning of your journey and to re-challenge them. And again, having chavrutot, who are on the same journey and can advise on the journey, through the podcast or in real life is critical there.
On that point, do you have any advice for people who are older and maybe feel like they don't have that sense of curiosity and openness to growth? I mean, obviously it can be very challenging. Someone who already has a wife and already has a kid and already has a reputation and they're already within a certain community. So having that openness and being able to really grow and have an open mind later in life can be a little harder. Baalei Teshuva obviously are forced to do something different. So do you have any advice from the Baalei Teshuva angle to someone who grew up from about being able to really, because Malam B'Kol Shein Moridim, we should always be trying to grow and learn and not be stuck in our old ways. So do you have any advice on that?
Finding motivation all along is difficult. I think there are two ways of learning, Bekiut and Iyun. I think most Baalei Teshuva start with Bekiut because they're trying to sort of catch up and that provides satisfaction to say, I've covered the whole Mishnah and understand there's no concept in Shas that I will meet and not be at least somewhat familiar with or understanding at the higher level is indeed a deep source of satisfaction. But then you've got the problem, okay, but now what do I do? There's so much to be learned. Where do I start and so on? And sometimes when you stay too superficial, I think Dafyomi, for all its wonders, hurt us a little bit as well. When you stay too superficial, you always have that feeling of not knowing and having to catch up and so on. What I found for myself, at least, is if I can take one small area and go deep into it and feel that I really master it, at least at the practical halachic level, that provides a deep source of satisfaction. And then you can say, okay, now let's pick another area and another area. I know that I spent a few years learning Ilchot Basar v'Chalav v'Ta'arovet Be'iyun, to the level that, when my wife has a question about, the meat pan and the basari, spoon and, vice versa, or friends or my parents or my sisters and so on, I feel I can answer those questions with confidence. And when I go check myself with the Rav, I see that I was right, in 90% of the cases, sometimes a bit too mahmir, as you would, sometimes do. But that provides a sense of satisfaction, sipuk, that gives motivation to go for another area and another area. I think one of the biggest, maybe to close there, one of the biggest insights in Torah learning is the power of regularity, of how, learning, even a certain area, 15 minutes a day, after 6 months, you've learned a significant amount of knowledge. And I find that when I can focus myself on one area and really master it after a while, I just feel much more willing, eager to embrace another one.
Well, I like that a lot. And I also personally feel that oftentimes when sometimes I'll get really into a sugya, and you might think, okay, like you learned it so well, or you wrote an article about it, but it's such a small sugya. But the Torah is so interconnected that you're going to end up finding something else related to that sugya, and that passion is really contagious within the realms of Torah. So I've also found that to be true as well. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time, and we really appreciate your feedback on the podcast, and I will thank you publicly for giving a lot of feedback, including not good feedback, which I appreciate a lot. It shows that you really care and you were willing to call me out on things that you think could be better and could be improved. So I appreciate that a lot. And thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to staying in touch.